was able to examine in minute detail the very, very complex phases of occupation at Jericho. She was able to see an awful lot that Garstang had simply missed.
What Garstang missed was crucial evidence contradicting his date for Jericho's destruction. Rather than the walls collapsing in 1400 BC, as Garstang believed, Kenyon concluded they had finally fallen 150 years before, in 1550 BC. If she was right, Jericho had been ruined long before Joshua could have left Egypt. An earthquake may have destroyed its walls, but it didn't coincide with Joshua's attack as Garstang originally supposed. And that's not the only problem facing the traditional version of Joshua's heroic conquest. If the Israelites did reach Jericho at the traditional date of 1400 BC, Kenyon's excavations revealed that the city they found would have looked very different to the one described in the Bible.
The defences had fallen into disuse. It was effectively undefended. Very little population there. It wouldn't have been much of a conquest, to be honest.
But if a battle for Jericho was unnecessary, it does beg the question why the Israelites' arrival is described as a conquest at all. Well, the Bible says Joshua's invasion didn't just involve Jericho. He destroyed other cities as well. But experts excavating those sites eventually hit similar problems.
The sites that are said to have been conquered by the Israelites, the archaeology shows that most of them weren't even inhabited at that time. And the sites at which we do have a destruction are not the ones mentioned in the biblical texts.
The archaeological record, it seems, no longer supports Joshua's story. And any lingering doubt was dispelled when historians realized that no Israelite army, however powerful, could have taken on the Canaanites. By 1400 BC, Egyptian forces had made Canaan part of their mighty Golden Empire. The Egyptians were unlikely to allow Joshua to invade their territory.
It is inconceivable that you could have had early Israel developing at the time when the Egyptian Empire was at its absolute peak. It doesn't make any sense at all.
In fact, almost all evidence unearthed since the 1950s has revealed a dramatic discrepancy between history and the Bible. In 1400 BC, Jericho was a village, not a walled city. There are no clear signs of Joshua's battles elsewhere, and Canaan was an Egyptian colony.
Historically and archaeologically, there's almost no evidence for a destruction, and certainly not in the 15th century when biblical chronology would require it to be placed. I think it's safe to say that almost no mainstream archaeologist or biblical scholar today takes the story in Joshua of the fall of Jericho literally.
Joshua's miraculous battle, it seems, is a myth after all. But that raises a new and explosive question. If Israelites didn't invade Canaan, then how did they get there? To answer this fundamental question, we need a benchmark. The earliest firm date by which we're certain Israelites were living in Canaan. Only then can we piece together what really happened. That benchmark is provided by an intriguing discovery made in Egypt. This is the Merneptah Stele, the record of an Egyptian military campaign in Canaan, led by Merneptah, the son of the pharaoh Ramesses II.
The Merneptah Stele, otherwise known as the Israel Stele, is the first mention of Israel outside the Bible. It dates, now we think, to about 1207 BC.
So if the Israelites were living in Canaan by 1207 BC, then Joshua's conquest, if there was one, must have begun sometime before. The question is when. We've seen no evidence of a conquest back at 1400 BC, the traditional date. However, there are some tantalizing clues 150 years after.
if you move down a century and a half or so, you reach a very good point in history in which it is much more feasible, and the archaeological evidence may support it to a larger extent.
Archaeological evidence from around 1250 BC is striking. It reveals a Canaanite world that did indeed collapse, often in destruction and fire. At first, the finds supported the idea that Joshua's conquest of Canaan did take place as the story records, only at a different date. But those hopes were soon dashed when further excavations across the rest of the eastern Mediterranean revealed something completely unexpected. Whatever destroyed Canaanite society also struck every other civilization in the region. Something else, something altogether more dramatic was going on.
What was going on is really one of the major revolutions in the history of the world, if you wish. A complete annihilation of the old world and the emergence of something completely different.
The cause of this catastrophe is a mystery. But a controversial new idea explaining it may also reveal how the conquest of Canaan really took place. The theory involves destruction, not inflicted by one military general, but by Mother Nature. Coincidentally, the idea involves earthquakes. But with a big difference to the tremors that destroyed the walls of Jericho 300 years before. This seismic activity shook the entire eastern Mediterranean. All ancient cities destroyed between 1225 and 1175 BC have been marked on this map.
Some of the sites are quite major. We have Mycenae on the Greek mainland, we have Troy, famous Troy in Anatolia, and then down here a cluster of sites in what is now modern-day Israel.
Another map records all significant earthquake activity monitored in the same area during the 20th century. With one map superimposed on the other, a remarkable pattern emerges.
There's almost a one-to-one correlation. Wherever we have a cluster of the ancient sites that were destroyed, we have modern earthquakes of high intensity that have taken place in the same region.
Until recently, it was inconceivable that earthquake activity could have caused so much destruction in the same area around the same time. But now it can be explained through a seismic phenomenon called an earthquake storm. Over the last century, scholars observing seismic activity in Turkey realized that earthquakes were progressing west along the North Anatolian Fault. In the last 4 years alone, tremors have killed some 18,000 people and left countless more homeless.
It seems that if you don't get a big earthquake releasing all the tension in the fault at once, what you sometimes get is a smaller earthquake releasing the tension in a part of the fault, which then puts pressure on the next segment, which will eventually go, and basically you get the fault unzipping along its line.
Klein suggests that 3,000 years ago, an earthquake storm migrated across the faults that not only run up the Jordan Valley, but fracture the entire eastern Mediterranean, with catastrophic consequences.
I think trade routes would have been cut. Eventually you're going to get an internal rebellion as people get hungry, and you will wind up with a systems collapse in which everything fails.
And it's the catastrophic collapse of the old world order, including Canaanite civilization, that could explain how early Israelites settled in Canaan. Not by conquest, but through simple opportunism.
It was a time when new groups could appear, could establish themselves. And the Israelites, these people we call Israelites or proto-Israelites, took advantage, I think, of this upheaval to insinuate themselves into areas previously not densely settled.
This is a far cry from the biblical account. But if Joshua and the Israelites did enter the Promised Land this way, by infiltration rather than conquest, then telltale signs of a new and distinctive people should begin to appear in the archaeological record. At first, there was no such evidence. Then, during the 1980s, archaeologists excavating the highlands of Israel and the West Bank began to find what they were looking for. The remains of hundreds of small farming communities, quite unlike the Canaanite buildings that had gone before. Among the archaeologists who excavated them was Israel Finkelstein. He took us to the village of Izbet Zata, 5 miles northeast of Tel Aviv, a small site he first excavated 25 years ago. The site is now badly overgrown, but it is still possible to make out some of the buildings. In particular, the outline of a new type of dwelling, a 4-room farmhouse, distinctly different from Canaanite architecture.
The building itself is over here with the central courtyard right in the middle and the 2 aisles on the sides. And the building was surrounded by silos for storing grain. And then there were more buildings on the outskirts.
Evidence supporting the idea that the new people who lived here were Israelites, not Canaanites, was in their diet. During the period archaeologists call Iron Age 1, there were no traces of bones from one animal common in Canaan, but banned in the Hebrew Bible: pigs.
We see something extremely interesting and new in their foodways, in their culinary practices. These people in the highlands, in the Iron One, do not eat pork.
This idea of a peaceful settlement of Canaan has now replaced the belief that the Israelites arrived in Canaan on the back of a military conquest. But in the wake of this conclusion, archaeologists began to ponder a new and even more remarkable scenario. What if the early Israelites had never actually arrived in Canaan at all? What if they had always lived there? Further excavations of the 4-room farmhouses suggested this could be a strong possibility. Distinct differences between this new culture and the Canaanites do exist, but there are also startling similarities. When archaeologists began to compare the pottery of the highland farmers to the old Canaanite population, they found something surprising.
Early Israelite society is, in many respects, it's a poorer reflection of Canaanite society, but it's not as fancy, it's not as sophisticated, but it's exactly the same.
Further parallels between Israelite and Canaanite cultures were found on the coast of Syria. Archaeologists excavating here at Ugarit uncovered an archive of clay tablets revealing details about Canaanite religion. One tablet contains the tale of a Canaanite king called Keret and his military conquests.
One of his methods of disposing of a city was to walk around it and blow trumpets at it. And you know, lo and behold, the walls come falling down.
All these parallels point towards a radical new theory, that Canaanites and Israelites were not just similar, they were identical. It's a controversial idea, but one seemingly supported by breakthroughs in genetic testing. Cultural anthropologist Yossi Nagar has been studying ancient Canaanite skeletons. By comparing their DNA with the DNA of the region's current population, he has concluded that many of today's Jews, Israeli Arabs, and Palestinians share a common racial heritage, suggesting that their ancestors, the Israelites and Canaanites, were once one and the same people.
The Israelis and the Canaanites are the same, only that they are separated. They're separated because of theology, not because of biology. They are the same.
If this controversial new theory gains acceptance, the history behind Joshua and his conquest will have to be completely revised. Joshua and his Israelite army did not march in and kill Canaanites. They were Canaanites.